On October 14, 1943, over the skies of Germany, thousands of bullets were fired, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. But most of them hit nothing. That day is etched into the memory of U.S. Air Force history as Black Thursday. Nearly 300 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force took off from bases in England, heading straight for Schweinfurt, the center of ball-bearing production in Nazi Germany, the mechanical heart of Hitler's war machine. On each B-17 were 10 men. They carried over 5,000 rounds of 12.7mm ammunition, believing their flying fortresses were invincible. But just hours later, 60 B-17s would never return. 600 young airmen were killed, captured, or missing. And the most terrifying part, most of them didn't hit a thing. In the side turret of a B-17 named Lucky Lady, 19-year-old gunner Eddie Kowalski gripped a Browning M2 tightly. He was the son of a factory worker in Detroit, the same factory that had built that very gun. Outside, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s came diving in like black arrows. Eddie spotted one slicing across his left view, about 300 yards out. He did everything by the book, aimed dead center at the enemy aircraft, pulled the trigger. The gun shook like a jackhammer. Brass shells flew everywhere. But the streaks of orange tracers zipped through the empty air behind the enemy's tail. The Bf-109 wasn't hit. It didn't even dodge. It flew by as if mocking him. Throughout 1943, that scene played out hundreds, even thousands of times. Brave, heavily armed, well-trained gunners, but they couldn't hit. Military analysts in Britain began to question, are we fighting with courage, but losing to physics? Gun camera footage from the U.S. Air Force was sent to a lab at Wright Field, Ohio. The findings stunned the entire strategic command. American gunners had an average hit rate of less than 4% on crossing enemy planes. That meant 96 out of every 100 bullets flew into empty space. Why? Bullets from the Browning M2 travel at 2,900 feet per second, nearly 900 meters per second, faster than the speed of sound. But the enemy was also moving at 300 miles per hour, about 440 feet per second. When a bullet takes 0.3 seconds to reach a target 300 yards away, the enemy aircraft has already moved over 130 feet, nearly the length of 11 cars. In other words, the gunner is aiming at where the enemy was, not where it will be. They were accurate, but always a third of a second too late. That problem had a name: deflection error. On the ground, no one noticed it. But in the sky, where everything moves at blistering speed, it was a death sentence. No matter how powerful a machine gun is, if it's not aimed right, it's just cold steel. In January 1943, the U.S. Air Force launched a large-scale study. At the Laredo Gunnery School in Texas, officers had trainees fire at aerial targets towed by planes. They fired thousands of rounds and still missed. Every time the target crossed their path, almost none of the bullets landed. Some instructors tried teaching lead shooting, aiming ahead of the target's path, but no one could do it, because instinctively people always aim directly at what they see. Every muscle, every reflex screamed, "Aim there!" But physics whispered, "No, aim at the empty space ahead." In Washington, Air Force generals argued fiercely. One side wanted to develop a new mechanical gun sight to automatically calculate the lead. The other believed the key was retraining humans, teaching them to trust the empty space. Both paths began at once. One led to labs at MIT, where young engineer Charles Stark Draper was developing a gyroscopic gun sight. The other continued at training grounds in Florida and Texas, where thousands of recruits kept firing in vain at crossing targets. Yet amid the chaos, the Americans stood firm on one thing: no one gave up. The 8th Air Force kept flying every day. Every mission cost them 10, 20, even 60 B-17s, but they kept going, because they knew that if they could just find a way to make even one bullet hit, just one, the battle for the skies would change. Somewhere in the smoke-filled rooms of MIT and on the explosive training ranges of Laredo, a revolution was brewing. A revolution not of weapons, but of human minds. And it would change the way mankind fights in the air forever. In the skies of war, not every bullet finds its mark. Some enemies wear no uniform, fire no shot, yet kill more than guns ever could. That enemy is physics. After hundreds of failed dogfights, U.S. officers were forced to admit a bitter truth. The problem wasn't courage, it was timing. From the moment a soldier pulls the trigger to the instant the bullet hits the target, only 0.3 seconds pass. But in that brief time, the enemy aircraft, often a Messerschmitt Bf-109 or Japanese Zero, has moved over 40 meters. That's enough for the bullet to hit nothing but air. At Wright Field, Ohio, in 1943, a team of engineers from the Army Air Force's Proving Ground Command was assigned to investigate this phenomenon. The team leader was Captain Robert Williams, 32, a former physics teacher who once lectured on kinetic energy and ballistic trajectories before joining the war. Williams and his team set up a simulation, a fixed Browning M2 machine gun aimed at a moving target simulating 300 miles per hour. The results were immediately clear. Every bullet missed behind the target. Williams wrote in his report, "The soldier isn't losing because he aims wrong. He's losing because time moves too fast. To hit the target, the gunner must aim ahead, into the empty space where the enemy plane will be in 0.3 seconds. But think about it. When you see a threat coming at you, what does your natural instinct tell you? Aim at it. No one on Earth can calmly aim into thin air and believe they're right. And that is the paradox of modern war. In 1943, gunnery schools in Laredo, Texas, Tyndall, Florida, and Las Vegas, Nevada, began testing new training methods. Trainees were put in mechanical simulators, machine guns mounted on moving trucks, firing at aerial targets towed by planes. But the results were still poor. Even when instructors shouted, "Lead your shot, aim ahead of the path," the soldiers' hands would instinctively drag the sights back to center, directly at the enemy plane. It wasn't their fault. It was the fault of human instinct, programmed by millions of years of survival to react instantly to direct threats. At Fort Worth, a military psychologist named Harold Kleen used high-speed cameras to study gunners' reflexes. His conclusion was shocking. Under stress, a soldier loses the ability to process the concept of future. He reacts only to the present that he sees. All efforts to teach calculation collapse under survival instinct. The issue became clear. Humans cannot defeat physics with instinct alone. There were only two options: train the brain to act against instinct, or build a tool to think for the soldier. Meanwhile, in Europe, RAF pilots faced the same issue. The guns on Spitfires and Hurricanes rarely hit unless the enemy was flying straight at them, a rare occurrence. In August 1940, during the fierce Battle of Britain, squadron leader Horace "Horry" Darley of the 609th made an unprecedented move. He grounded his squadron for 3 days just to practice lead shooting. Darley, a former bird hunter, understood that shooting a plane was no different than shooting a clay pigeon. He trained pilots to feel the motion. No calculations, no hesitation. Just put the barrel where the prey is going. The result? Hit rates doubled from 6% to 12%. A small number, but in war, that 6% meant hundreds of lives. The Americans took note. A group of young U.S. Air Force engineers at the MIT Radiation Laboratory began developing an automatic aiming device based on an idea by Professor Charles Stark Draper, later known as the father of inertial navigation. Draper understood one simple but profound truth. Humans make mistakes, but machines don't feel fear. In July 1943, he presented the first prototype of the Mark 14 gyro gun sight, a gyroscopic aiming device. It was a small attachment mounted on a machine gun containing a gyroscope system to detect the angular speed of the target. When the gunner moved the sight, the internal mechanical computer would automatically calculate the lead, displaying a glowing phantom dot exactly where the bullet would hit after 0.3 seconds. No calculations needed, no guessing, just trust the light. The only problem, the Mark 14 was still in prototype. It weighed nearly 13 kilograms, was expensive, and required electrical power from the aircraft, something not all planes had. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of gunners were still fighting each day with nothing but instinct and prayers. In the Pacific, Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a tail gunner on the USS Lexington aircraft carrier, began figuring it out on his own. After surviving 31 missions, he noticed a strange pattern. If I aimed about 2 plane lengths ahead of the enemy's nose, I usually hit. He sketched this insight in his personal notebook, rough diagrams of zeros with lead paths drawn ahead. They were primitive, but far more accurate than any chart. In March 1944, when his notebook reached Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, legendary U.S. Navy ace, O'Hare immediately understood. This is the formula we need. Teach them to see with instinct, but trust in experience. Thus was born the spot shooting method, training gunners to aim into the space ahead of a moving target by a certain number of aircraft lengths, depending on speed. 1, 2, or 3 plane lengths. No formulas, just practiced intuition turned into reflex. In the skies, bullets still rained like storms, but now some of them began to find their mark. Young soldiers, the Eddie Kowalskis everywhere, still trembled as they pulled the trigger, but they no longer aimed at the enemy plane. They aimed at the future. And in that empty space, history began to change direction. The world can win with weapons, but to keep that victory, people must understand how to hit the target. In early 1943, as the bodies of young pilots were brought back from Europe, the U.S. Air Force realized the issue was no longer in the weapons, but in how people were trained to use them. Letters from the front, soaked in sweat and aircraft oil, read, "We fired, we fought, but the enemy kept flying." The generals decided to launch a new program, one that taught people to go against their instincts. At Laredo Air Force Base, Texas, under the scorching 104-degree sun, thousands of recruits trained on massive firing ranges. There, engineers turned theory into reality, mounting machine guns on trucks, driving them down dirt roads, firing at moving targets pulled by steel cables. Every exercise was meticulously recorded, every angle calculated. For the first time in the history of war, a soldier was taught to aim at where there's nothing. Chief Instructor, Major Harold L. Pope, rasped to the recruits through a voice hoarse from dust, "Don't aim at what you see, aim at where you think it will go." At first, they laughed, but weeks later, when the first lead shots struck the moving targets, the laughter turned to amazement. Physics, finally, had been tamed by humans. At Tyndall Field, Florida, once an aerial gunnery training base, the U.S. military installed something unprecedented, a cinematic shooting simulator. On a wide screen, enemy aircraft flew across the sky. Trainees held real guns, firing beams of light. A camera system tracked their aim, measured delay and angles, and displayed results instantly. It was the beginning of virtual reality simulation, nearly 80 years before the term VR existed. Thousands of soldiers went through this process monthly. They didn't learn through words. They learned through reflex. Every day. 5 a.m. physical training, 7 a.m. theory, quick lunch, afternoon simulation, evening journaling. The average trainee fired over 5,000 rounds during the course, 5 times the 1942 standard. These young men, many just 18 or 19, were taught something simple yet profound: to trust math and discipline over emotion. One of them, Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, a survivor of the Schweinfurt raid, was reassigned as an instructor. In his diary, he wrote, "I used to tremble when I pulled the trigger. Now I teach them how not to. Not because we're braver, but because we understand better." At the same time, on the East Coast, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, a group of engineers under Professor Charles Stark Draper, the soldier in a lab coat, worked day and night. They didn't shoot, didn't fly, but they were fighting too, with numbers. Draper and his team developed the Mark 14 gyro gun sight, a device that would transform the battlefield. It contained a gyroscopic system, an angular velocity sensor, and a mechanical computer the size of a hand. As the gunner moved the weapon, the system instantly calculated angular speed and bullet trajectory, projecting a small green dot on the lens, the exact point where the bullet would meet the target. No more guesswork, no more estimates. Just keep the glowing dot on the enemy aircraft and pull the trigger. The first tests were conducted at Norfolk Air Force Base, Virginia, in August 1943. The results stunned commanders. Gunners using the Mark 14 achieved an 18% hit rate on the first day. Within a week, it rose to 25%, 5 times the previous average. But time was something America didn't have. The war was still raging, and thousands of planes had to fly each day. Draper understood. Technology and people had to be merged immediately. By spring 1944, 2 parallel programs began. The Mark 14 was mass-installed on new fighter aircraft. The spot shooting method, developed by William Fleming in the Pacific, was taught across the fleet. On aircraft carriers Lexington, Essex, and Enterprise, Fleming walked the decks with a stick mounted with a model plane, showing gunners how to lead by 2 lengths, 3 lengths, depending on the shot. No blackboards, no formulas, just instinct, drilled to perfection. The results were astonishing. Within 2 months, average accuracy doubled from 4% to over 9%, then quickly surpassed 20% when combined with the Mark 14. An officer wrote in a report to the Navy Department, "We've made the invisible visible. They no longer shoot at the present, they shoot at the future." Across U.S. factories, the Train to Win movement spread. Workers assembled models, framed targets, and shipped tons of ammunition to training centers. The press called it the Second Front, the front of knowledge and industry. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Air Force had over 40,000 gunners trained in deflection shooting. Young men who once feared the skies now flew with calm and precision, knowing they weren't just pulling a trigger, they were protecting those flying beside them. When their first lead-guided bullet struck, when the first enemy plane exploded, no one cheered. They just went quiet. Because they understood. Behind every bullet that hit was thousands of hours of work from laborers, engineers, and teachers. Across America, from Draper's lab to the training grounds of Laredo, one belief united them all. Humans can relearn how to see the world if they are patient enough. June 6, 1944. A gray dawn cloaked the shores of France, and in that sky, thousands of engines roared, carrying those who had learned to shoot into the future. Operation Overlord, also known as D-Day, was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 11,000 Allied aircraft, including hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, flew above 150,000 troops advancing into Normandy. Inside each of those planes were young gunners, once trembling during training, now carrying a new belief that they could do what physics once mocked humans for trying. When the command tower's whistle blew, the sky turned into a storm of metal. German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Explosions lit up the air like 1,000 stars. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s swooped in, diving into bomber formations like hawks. But this time, the Americans were different. In the rear gunner's seat of a B-17, nicknamed Liberty Bell, Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, now a veteran with 25 missions, calmly adjusted the Mark 14 sight. A Focke-Wulf cut across at a 60-degree angle, 400 yards out. Eddie turned the dial, aligned the reticle with the enemy's wingspan, held the glowing green dot just ahead of the fighter's nose, exactly 2 fuselage lengths. He didn't watch the enemy plane. He focused on the floating dot, then pulled the trigger. The Browning M2 shook violently. Bright orange tracer rounds zipped into the nothingness. Half a second later, the Focke-Wulf was hit, engulfed in flames. Eddie exhaled. No cheers. He simply said, "Physics, I beat you this time." Across the skies of Normandy, that miracle played out hundreds of times. Those who had failed in training, who once didn't trust their new instincts, were now turning empty space into real victories. American gunners in this campaign achieved hit rates over 20%, 5 times higher than 2 years prior. The Mark 14 gyro gun sight proved the power of intellect, calculating firing solutions dozens of times per second, displayed in real time, all through mechanics and gyroscopes without a single electronic chip. On the ground, German troops called those flying fortresses steel bees, because no matter how much fire they took, they kept advancing, wave after wave, without stopping. A German officer later wrote in his diary, "The Americans fight not with hot blood, but with something colder, perhaps reason." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, gunners of the U.S. Fifth Fleet were also applying William Fleming's spot shooting method. On the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, Fleming stood beside new recruits, holding a model plane, pointing it into the distance. "When it cuts across, don't look at it. Look ahead of it, and believe the bullet will get there." They obeyed, and the results were astounding. From May to August 1944, average Navy gunner hit rates rose from 4.2% to 9.1%, then surpassed 12% within 3 months. A naval officer wrote in a report to Pacific Command, "This is no longer instinct, it's technique, it's science, it's faith in human knowledge." The Air Force and the Navy, once separate in method, now found common ground. Belief in the learning human. In the summer of 1944, after D-Day, factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Boston stayed lit through the night. MIT ramped up mass production of the Mark 14, shipping thousands of units to Europe each month. Training centers like Kingman Field, Arizona, and Buckley Field, Colorado, expanded, producing tens of thousands more gunners. In just 6 months, America trained over 20,000 men to lead targets, something every expert in early 1943 called impossible. These young soldiers, many of whom had never seen the ocean, never left their hometowns, were now mastering the laws Newton wrote 3 centuries earlier. To them, each bullet was an equation, a belief. In the skies, through gunfire and smoke, they turned mathematics into survival. The Normandy campaign ended in decisive victory. Thousands of Allied troops set foot on French soil, paving the way for the march to Berlin. But behind that victory, few remember. It began with a simple lesson: shooting at nothing. In a year-end report to High Command in 1944, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, wrote, "We have proven that the mind can triumph over instinct. The true strength of America lies not in steel mills or factories, but in the potential of every person when they choose to learn, to adapt, and to believe in what's right." As the winter of 1944 arrived, those soldiers kept pressing into the German skies. They were no longer frightened boys, but warriors of reason, carrying not just guns and ammunition, but the spirit of an industry that dares to dream, to think, and to act. And they were about to write the final chapter, over the skies of Germany. Spring 1945. The skies over Germany were ablaze, but this time, American soldiers no longer fought in the shadows of error. They fought with eyes illuminated by understanding. From bases scattered across England, Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, Kimballton, hundreds of B-17 and B-24 flying fortresses took off again, their bomb loads headed for Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden. These were the final months of the war, but also its fiercest air battles. The Nazi Luftwaffe, though exhausted, threw in everything it had left, from squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s to a terrifying new weapon, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, the world's first jet-powered combat aircraft, flying at nearly 900 km/h. At that speed, the Me-262 moved so fast that a bullet from a Browning M2 needed less than a third of a second to hit. But that was still enough time for the enemy to escape the line of fire if the gunner didn't know how to lead the shot. But by 1945, the Americans were ready for that. Inside the gunner's compartment of the B-17 Heaven Sent, Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, now a veteran and instructor, calmly adjusted the dials on his Mark 14 gyro gun sight. He wasn't guessing anymore. The gyroscopic sight from MIT, Charles Stark Draper's mechanical masterpiece, now performed dozens of calculations per second, compensating for angular velocity, altitude, centrifugal force, and projected a precise electronic dot to within hundredths of a second. Eddie kept the dot just ahead of the Me-262, cutting across. He squeezed the trigger. The 12.7mm rounds screamed through the air. Half a second later, the German jet exploded like a shattered star. Over the radio, the navigator's voice crackled. "Hit confirmed! He's down!" The squadron remained silent. No cheering, no excitement, just the stillness of men who understood. This was a victory of knowledge. Reports from the 8th Air Force showed extraordinary results. Gunner accuracy increased from 4%, 1943, to 20 to 25%, 1945. Average mission losses dropped nearly 40%, and for the first time in 2 years, U.S. forces recorded more German planes shot down than American planes lost. These weren't just statistics. They were the result of millions of study hours, tons of draft paper, thousands of engineers, and the unwavering resolve of a nation that refused to lose. In February 1945, during a massive bombing raid over Dresden, waves of B-17s flew in tight formations through heavy anti-aircraft fire. Exploding shells lit the sky, shrapnel tore through fuselages, but the formations didn't break. Over the intercom, a young pilot's hoarse voice said, "Hold formation. Trust the dot in front of you. It'll bring us home." That phrase spread throughout the squadron, becoming the unofficial motto of the U.S. Air Force in its final months. Trust the dot. That same spring, hundreds of B-29 superfortresses began soaring over the Pacific, heading for Japan. The gunners on B-29s now used an upgraded version of the Mark 14, the Mark 18 computing gun sight, capable of automatically adjusting the lead angle for remotely operated gun turrets. For the first time in history, a compact mechanical computer was smart enough to aim the gun itself. It was the birth of the fire control era, the foundation of all precision weapons systems to come. And amid all these breakthroughs, people still remembered the humble names: Horace Darley, RAF pilot, the first to teach soldiers to aim into empty space; William Fleming, Navy gunner who sketched 3 lead lines by hand in an old notebook; Charles Stark Draper, who turned math into mechanics and mechanics into trust; and the thousands of unnamed workers, the hands that assembled every screw, polished every lens, and tested every gyro to ensure that when a soldier aimed at that dot, they were seeing the precision of an entire nation. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But at bases across England, many American soldiers couldn't sleep. They sat beside their aircraft wings, staring up at the silent sky. No more engines, no more flak. Sergeant Eddie Kowalski wrote in his final journal entry before returning home. I used to think victory came from bigger guns, bigger bombs. But no, it came from learning to see differently. Not at where the enemy is, but where the enemy will be. And maybe that's how mankind defeats fate. The skies over Germany were silent, but on the ground, America was entering a new era, the era of scientific thinking and faith in human capability. The principles forged in war, lead the target, anticipate the future, trust the math, became guiding philosophies in every field, from aerospace and missiles to computers and space. From the Mark 14 gun sight, the world moved on to the Apollo guidance system, also developed by Draper and MIT, that took humankind to the moon. And it all began with a small glowing dot in a gun sight. They fought not just to win, but to prove that humans can learn to overcome instinct. Today, the few remaining B-17s are displayed in museums. The Browning M2 remains a symbol of enduring firepower, and the Mark 14, the 13-kilogram mechanical computer, now rests behind glass like a sacred relic. Visitors look at the glowing dot on its lens, and few can imagine that it once saved tens of thousands of lives. From the failures of 1942 to the victory of 1945 was a 3-year journey, but one that redefined the relationship between humanity and knowledge. When people understand the world, they are no longer victims of physics. They become its master. And that was the spirit of American industry in World War II, resilient, inventive, unwilling to accept impossible. They learned to shoot into the future, and by doing so, they rewrote history.